the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. My name is Philip Boone, and I use he, him, his pronouns. My co-host is Caitlin Drake, who uses the female pronouns she, her, hers. Before we begin, I like to state that the views represented in this podcast are those of the individuals in this conversation and not the official position of Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. This is a part of a series of episodes featuring conversations centered on resisting the traditional plan in Oklahoma. As we lead up to General Conference 2020, and as the United Methodist Church continues to deny full inclusion of LGBTQ plus peoples, we feel it is important especially to lift up these voices and experiences. Today, our guest is Toby Jenkins, Executive Director and CEO of Oklahomans for Equality and the Dennis R. Neal Equality Center here in Tulsa. Welcome, Toby.
Hello, and I use male pronouns, he, him, and his.
So today we'd really like to take advantage of your knowledge and experience and expertise through your time at the Equality Center to talk about the impact of both affirming and non-affirming faith communities on folks in the LGBTQ plus community. So as director of OKEQ, I'm sure you have seen direct examples of the impact on an individual when their faith community does not affirm them. Can you share a little bit about that?
So I get asked this question on a regular basis. And for our purposes, I want you to rest upon the fact that it is going to be significant that I'm going to tell you this week's issues. I'm not having to draw on past experiences or something that happened a week ago. This is just what we're dealing with today while I sit here at this mic. I have a 19-year-old who's been sleeping in her car because she was kicked out of a university in Okla because the Christians in her class could not stand her presence and bullied her and pressured her and then trapped her in a corner, and she pushed her way through, and then the university's response was that she had become violent because she pushed her way out of them Bible bashing her. So she finds herself totally kicked out of her university, which means she doesn't have a place to sleep, she doesn't have a place to eat, and she's living in her car. At the very same time, I have an 18-year-old who is a senior at Broken Arrow High School who's been we found out this week she's been sleeping in her car for 2 weeks because she came out to her parents and they kicked her out of the house, and she's paying for her car. So fortunately, she had that possession. We're trying to get her into a shelter. They did it because they felt like Jesus wanted them to show tough love. Both of those incidents are this week's incidents. Both of them have at their heart oppressive, discriminatory, violent actions directed at LGBTQ individuals because of their identity, and the people perpetuating those are invoking their religious faith.
Let's talk about church trauma. What is church trauma within the LGBTQ plus community?
We at the Equality Center usually call it religious trauma because church would make you suggest that only Christian communities are the ones that have internal positions that can be oppressive and discriminatory and non-affirming. And so we work with lots of individuals who've experienced religious trauma. I mean, we have a sizable group of Muslim Arab students who are students here at our universities here in the Tulsa area, and they cannot be out to their families. They are terrified of their families finding out about their sexual orientation. We also work with individuals who are from some other faith communities. So we call it religious trauma, and we see that where your identity is being threatened and you living into your authentic identity is being suppressed, and you feel a sense of rejection and you feel a sense of alienation that you've let your family down, you've let your faith community down. And so as an example of that is last night in our coming out workshop, we had a 19-year-old So she is a student from Missouri who is doing an internship at one of our chemical plants here in the region. And she came to us, was in our coming out workshop last night, and her biggest challenge is that she comes from a very small United Methodist church where her pastor and her parents have supported the traditional plan. And she can remember this minister when she was in the seventh grade. The seventh grade of this minister celebrating the Duck Dynasty's position on opposing gay marriage, and that still stands out in her mind. And so she's experiencing some anxiety. She's afraid of some isolation, afraid she's going to be letting her family down, but she's at that place that she feels like she needs to come out to her parents. And so she came to our coming out workshop, and it's a United Methodist Church. Now, I was delighted that I was able to tell her, well, while you're in town, we have another United Methodist Church that takes a different position, and there's a sizable college group there. But that was the basis of her. The basis of her anxiety was what we call religious trauma, and we see this a lot of time in our coming out workshop. We see this a lot of time on our helpline. Usually, the initial calls from individuals who are experiencing the most anxiety, the most sense of isolation, or in a great emotional distress is because of the faith community and how it's impacted maybe their family or someone they love, and interfering and slipping into that relationship. You know, it's one thing when your church doesn't accept you, but if it forces your parents not to accept you, or they're going to be isolated or alienated, then that creates another level of this religious trauma where you not only feel like, you know, they've done this to you, but now you've made your parents and your siblings and maybe your grandparents, you've made them experience alienation. So that's how we call it religious trauma, because it's just not isolated to Christians. And we see how it has several layers on individuals who are trying to deal with their authentic identities.
Do you have any statistics around the role of faith communities in the lives of LGBTQ folks?
Yeah, we do. In fact, we have some just recent data that was a part of our assessment that was done last year, and it's called the PRISM Project. And you can find it online, just PRISM at OU, PRISM Project OU. And it was Dr. Chan Helm's department did this assessment. About 1,400 individuals were assessed. And we made part of the assessment, we wanted to really assess our community. And it's kind of regional, it's the area. It's not just Tulsa specific, because we made sure that we wanted to hear what experience for LGBT individuals in rural areas was like. But a sizable portion of that assessment, that survey, we wanted to know what people's interactions and their feelings were with faith community. And so the questions were, have you participated in a faith community in the last 3 years? Are you a member of a faith community? Do you actively participate? And then it went through there and it asked statistically of that group, have you had to hide your sexual identity? Have you had to hide your gender identity? Have you had to endure cruel and hurtful things said from the pulpit? Have you had your church suggest that you need to seek professional counseling to change your sexual orientation? So it asks a lot of that, and we could clearly see what we already know exists, that a sizable portion of the LGBTQ community do not identify with a faith community. It was about where we expect it to be, which I think was about 68% had no affiliation, at least in the last 3 years. Now, we didn't really ask the question, did you come from a faith community and leave it? We wanted to know what your experience was in the last 3 years. So we have that data, and we compared it to similar assessment we did 15 years ago through the Community Service Council, and it's pretty much statistically the same, hadn't changed much. That was the same experience. Now, what was unusual is the question was, is your church an affirming, inclusive church? The numbers just shot up dramatically from 15 years ago. So if you can imagine, and maybe some of our listeners, this will be on where they identify in their age, but 15 years ago, there were only a handful of affirming, inclusive congregations, faith communities in the Tulsa area. It was under 10, and maybe even less than that. So that has really dramatically increased, and it's kind of all over the board. I mean, there are some churches that are very inclusive. LGBTQ people can participate in the full life of the church. They have access to serving in the ministry. Their ceremonies are recognized and can be officiated by the clergy in the church. And then you have other congregations where perhaps the pastor is welcoming and he's trying to move the church in that direction. And maybe there's some families. There may even be some token gay couples or, a token lesbian who goes there. But they're wanting folks to know we're not going to be a hostile community. For us, hostility, this is how we categorize that. A hostile faith community is where they see you as broken, disordered, and that you needed to be fixed, converted, or transformed. If they'll take the position that they value you for who you are, who you love, and how you identify, then we consider that to be a welcoming space. It may not be an inclusive space. It may not even be an affirming space, but we consider it to be a welcoming space. And we will have clergy persons who will send us a formal letter asking to be added to our faith page. So we clearly lay that out on our faith page. We say, these churches can do your marriages, or these churches allow same-sex attracted individuals to consider credentialing for ordination. So we lay that out, and statistically, that number has increased just dramatically. In fact, it's almost shocking if you stop and think about it. We're the dead center of the country. We are considered one of the most religiously conservative, predominantly Christian fundamentalist conservative, one of the most religiously conservative states in the country. And the fact that in the middle of the country is one of the largest LGBT rights organizations, one of the largest and oldest, and yet also has one of the largest connection and networks of affirming communities. That's kind of, that's phenomenal for me because we're seeing that number grow. Certainly we've seen denominations take some really brave steps. We always know this, as I know this as a gay man, if you stand with me, then you are going to experience the same rejection, discrimination, and oppression that I do. It's like if you're going to be our friend, then be prepared to get faced with what we are faced with. And we see that with faith communities. We see they'll take a strong position saying that they affirm LGBT individuals, and then you'll hear another pastor from another church blast them and categorize them and preach against them and cast aspersion. I always like to tell this story about the statistical part. I found out that there was an affirming minister in town sitting in the pew at First Methodist Church when Dr. Jim Buskirk was blasting Russell Bennett at Fellowship Congregational Church on Harvard Avenue, that they were affirming LGBT individuals and allowing them to get married, and the Congregational Church was allowing them to go into the ministry. And that's how I found out I found a spiritual leader for me to go talk to was from the pastor in the pulpit blasting him, and I went directly to him. And so when I came out, he helped me navigate my coming out journey, keep my faith intact, and have a very civil divorce with my wife at that time, and make sure that we raised our children in a mutually respecting each other and having a healthy relationship with our family. And I thank Russell Bennett for that. So statistically, we have that. It's all available. You can Google that. Just Google Prism Project OU, and it pops right up in the link, and it'll give you the data on that.
You mentioned this increase in churches that are affirming and churches that are welcoming. Can you share why that matters? What an example or two of an individual when a faith community does affirm them, and just how different it is from some of those stories you shared of folks who weren't being affirmed?
In this city, in the city of Tulsa, and we have St. Jerome's Parish Church of St. Jerome's. It was started by Episcopalians who did not feel affirmed and welcome when they were at Trinity Episcopal. And the priest that founded that church wanted to be ordained, wanted to go into the ministry, and their ordination council said, that's fine, but you're going to have to keep your partner a secret, and you can't really be transparent about your sexuality because of the church's present prohibition. That is what we were forced to do. When I came out, the church I went to was Metropolitan Community Church. Now, I went there because Reverend Russell Bennett recommended I go there because he knew I needed to interact with other people. And it was significant because I can remember the first time that I went to what I considered an affirming church. I drove it around it multiple times, and it was pouring down rain, and the parking lot was full, and it was this little blank old building in North Tulsa, barely looked like a church. And I had rental property next door. I should have known where it was at, but I had never known that was the gay church. And so I drove around, and I can remember having to park quite a ways away, and it's pouring down rain, and I was drenched. And as I walked up the sidewalk, as I was walking there, I thought, I must have the wrong place. This can't be where I'm supposed to be going. Because I could hear, oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, how I love Jesus. Oh, and I could hear hundreds of people singing at the top of their lungs. And I can remember walking through the door, and it was packed, and it looked just like any other church. Except if you looked real close, you noticed that there were men holding hands and women holding hands. And I love to tell this story. Beverly Taylor, we call her Tigger. I stood there, and I stood on the back pew, and I was just weeping. Because all of a sudden, I was in a room full of same-gender loving people, and they were loving Jesus. And Jesus was loving them back. And I remember standing there, and I was just sobbing. And Tigger, she was kind of serving at the altar. She walked all the way to the front, and she walked back. And she reached out her hand, and she said, welcome. We've been waiting for you. And for several months, that was a very formative place for me to be able to express my faith and it feel warm, and I was encouraged to follow my faith, and I was being encouraged to do that by other LGBTQ believers. And eventually I left that and I went to another church, and then I needed to be back in a Methodist church because I was a Methodist. And I just prayed about it and prayed about it and prayed about it. And I ended up at Boston Avenue because this is where the Lord led me to be. I mean, I didn't need to research it. I didn't need to search it or study it. I just felt this sense that this is where I was supposed to be. And I can remember meeting with Dr. Moose on Biggs. And I said, now over at First Methodist Church, they've told me I can't take communion because I'm I'm living in sin. And I asked him, I said, well, if I come here with my children, will I be able to take communion? And he said to me, this is the Lord's table. This is not the Methodist table. They can't exclude anybody from the table. This is the Lord's table. And that was incredibly affirming. The first Christmas Eve that, I'd have my children half the day, and I wanted to be able to go to church. And the only time I got to worship with my children in my church was on Christmas Eve. And so my children were with me, and we came to the children's service. We had kind of traditionally done that at Boston Avenue as our family going back a long time. But I remember the first time I was able to take communion with my children when I hadn't been able to take communion with them for like 3 or 4 years. And the children's service, there's nothing really, it doesn't feel very sacred or holy. It's kind of a train wreck, and it's kind of chaos. It's just like, people are spilling stuff and dropping stuff, and the
somebody's crying somewhere.
The adults having to tell, go ahead and tell them this, and so this real reluctant kid, this is the body and blood of Christ said for you, but it was like I was in the room with Jesus and the disciples that first experience. To be able to do that with my children. And of course, my children are now adult, married with kids, and they just went all sorts of ballistic on me this year when they found out that the children's service had changed and the bells, because they have their own congregations that they attend, and so we had changed all that. They were so upset because tradition had been changed. Yet we came, and my grandkids raved, said it was the best service we'd ever been to, because they got to sit at tables in color and had a blast and loved it. It was funny. My adult children did not care for the service, but their kids loved it. That they said, well, this was so much fun, and they got more out of the service that day than they normally do. So anyway, that's perspective.
In February of 2019, the UMC was in the headlines, it seemed like nonstop, for how they were treating LGBTQ plus people. It can impact LGBTQ plus folks who've never stepped foot in the United Methodist Church. Would you be able to talk about that?
It just reaffirmed once again what most people, 68% of those who surveyed in our assessment, have no place for religion or faith or God in their life, and they just use that as an opportunity. This is why we don't want to have anything to do with people of faith. They already didn't expect anything different. And so for the Methodist Church to look like they had tightened up that grip and said, we're not going to improve, we're not going to do better, we're not going to follow the Lord. That's my editorial opinion. It just reaffirmed that is my biggest fear. We are fast seeing what I consider the death of faith in our culture, where most people do not identify as people of faith, don't really see that it's significant, don't have a place, doesn't have a role in their life. And we can give credit where credit needs to be given. It's given to the confusing message, not just the Methodist Church, but the confusing messages that churches send all the time, that the message and the actions don't match. We say God loves you and everybody's welcome, and then we exclude you, or we take really hateful positions against individuals who are making some really hard decisions in their life. And we've politicized it, and there's a lot of things there, and I think we may have, my personal assessment, I think we may have reached the tipping point. We may have went now too far, that we're on a trajectory that I think you're going to see unbelief and faith just increase. And you see it in diminishing church attendance, and the polls tells us, all the Gallup polls tell us that less and less people identify as believers. And so, and it's certainly not from, there's a proliferation of churches, and have new churches and new ideas and new concepts and new ways to do church. And we're trying to be hip and cool and make sure we identify with everybody, and yet we still see the numbers dropping of individuals who identify as people of faith. And so that particular news cycle just reinforced, and my Facebook feed was full of people who posted it and posted as an example of the church is not our friend. On my board of directors, it's usually pretty common that the biggest majority of our board of directors for the Equality Center would identify as secular, humanist, or atheist or agnostic. But almost universally, all of them came from a church background, either graduated from Christian universities, may have even been in the ministry, but have no church affiliation or faith affiliation or any faith confession. They don't even identify themselves as a believer any longer. It's very common, and so I have to be very cautious and careful that if on a regular basis, my board has to address and deal with my concepts of doing work, equality work, because they feel it feels too much like a church, that we're doing something that a church ought to do. And so they'll kind of, this is you just feeling religious guilt, or this is just you trying to practice your faith. And so I get my hand slapped quite a bit on what is considered me mixing my personal life with my professional life. We also saw a lot of individuals who blamed the churches that maybe they had found safety and sanctuary in just because they attended there. So like, I made a post where I was grateful for my church and that my church saw this different, and we did not, that my church and the leaders of our church did not take. And that ended up just being a cat fight on my own Facebook page, where individuals blasted, Boston Avenue because of their background, their experiences. I just last weekend attended a funeral where it was said from the pulpit of this individual who had died by suicide. They'd taken their own life. They talked about the struggle. They grew up here at Boston Avenue and sang in the youth choirs and did not feel like they got the support they needed, and that's how they had ended up at another church. And yet he had dealt with that trauma all of his life and took his life at 52 years old. So when it ended up in the news cycle, it just, just threw gasoline on the fire for people to blast. And I had lots of people who reached out to me that they felt like we ought to boycott the Methodist Church and we shouldn't have the Pride Parade at Boston Avenue. Then I had to remind them, we're not really having it at Boston Avenue. We're having it that's our staging area, and they're gracious enough to let us do that. And that was the only place in downtown that would let us really host. I mean, we can have it on the street without your help or permission, but for us to have parking lots and bathrooms and air conditioning and water fountains, that means y'all have to want us here and invite us in. And so I had to remind them that, we're being asked to be there, and they're helping us. And, we don't need to. Now, I've never been a fan of boycotting, but there were people who wanted me to boycott it, and they wanted me to move the Pride Parade. And so I said, well, where would you like for us to move it? First Presbyterian? Would you like for us to move it to Holy Family, First Baptist Church? Our options are not real great, folks.
There are all of these layers to it, right? There's the personal experience, perhaps, of church trauma or religious harm. There's family experience and how that bleeds out into families or communities. And then I think in Oklahoma, harmful theology doesn't just stay inside of those institutions or inside of those families, but it also bleeds into our legislation and our public policy. And I know that the Equality Center is doing some policy advocacy work right now. So what are some of the policies and issues?
Well, I've been this is 26 years now, 25, 26 years that I've been involved in advocating for LGBTQ persons at the Oklahoma State Capitol. And in 25 years, we've always had a bill. Sometimes we've had 30 bills targeting LGBT individuals. And so you see that, and every time you have the legislator who introduces the bill, they'll invoke the name of Jesus while they're doing it. In committees, when they're debating it, they'll invoke the Bible. On the floor, they'll invoke the Bible, and they'll push and push and push to push this anti-LGBTQ legislation. Right now, we have a bill that would ban conversion therapy by licensed mental health professionals. And just in the hearing this past week, where it passed, 10 legislators supported the bill to ban conversion therapy, and so now hopefully we'll get a floor vote. But those who opposed it quoted the Bible, and they used the illustration about what if a mother doesn't want her kid to be gay? What if she finds out her kid's gay and she doesn't want her to be gay? Shouldn't she be able to take them to a therapist to change them? And these were legislators. I mean, that's the whole crux of the problem is, people go to these professionals who claim they can change somebody's sexual orientation, and I've never met anybody who did. And I was actively seeking. I went and saw a religious therapist for 13 years. I never felt any different. I was very actively involved in networking and conferences and things when I was trying to resolve this issue and was a part of what we call the ex-gay ministry programs. I never met anybody who actually changed their sexual orientation. Now, I met lots of people who weren't acting upon their same-sex attraction, and they were in heterosexual marriages, and they were trying to live heterosexual lives, or they were trying to deny their gender identity and live in the gender they were assigned at birth. I saw lots of people doing that, but I never met anybody who said that they actually could had changed their sexual orientation. They still felt like it was some dark secret that they had to fight about fight against some inclination. So we see it all the time work its way into legislation. Every time the city of Tulsa has tried to pass an ordinance to improve and add protections for LGBTQ persons in the city of Tulsa, the people who have showed up to oppose it have not done it from an economic standpoint. They've not done from a data, best practices, here's the measurables. They've showed up and opposed it quoting the Bible. And I love the story about when the city council was trying to add housing protections for LGBTQ persons in Tulsa that had the full support of the council and full support of the mayor's office. And that night in that public hearing, we have to have 2 public hearings on ordinances. There was a lady who stood there and talked about how awful gay people were because she had a lesbian sister, and that's why we called our Pride Festival the Pride Festival, because we're so proud and haughty. And she's quoting that, and I will never forget City Councilman Blake Ewan said, "Ma'am, I'm going to try in 1 minute to undo what obviously a lifetime of Sunday school did not do. Jesus loves everybody." it was the best line. And of course, his father is a Christian therapist, and so I felt like he could speak from that position. But we We had Mayor Dewey Bartlett whenever the housing ordinance was being passed. Somebody questioned him that, what about Christians who don't want to let a gay couple rent in their house? And Dewey Bartlett, this got picked up by national media. He goes, if you don't want to let somebody have a place to live, you ought to be taken out behind the chicken coop and whooped. That was what because he said it's a fundamental right. Call yourself a Christian and you want to deny somebody housing because of their sexual orientation. He said, yeah, you ought to just be taken behind the chicken coop and whooped. Where he came up with that analogy, I don't know. But it got picked up in the national news that this Republican mayor had supported housing protections for LGBTQ persons. So yes, it's what we deal with all the time. And now, this is the hypocrisy of it. Usually the people who are pushing the legislation and introducing the legislation, they have skeletons in their own closets. They either have family members who are LGBTQ who they have real hostile relationships with and blame them for all their unhappiness, or they have their own issues. We had a state senator who was actually having a sexual relationship with an underage minor and buying him drugs and paying him to have sex in a motel room just within blocks of the Capitol. And at the same time was quoting the Bible and opposing legislation that was the city of Tulsa was being targeted as a rogue city. He called us a rogue city because we had protections that were protecting LGBTQ persons, and he said the city was leading the state astray, and yet this man was molesting a child, giving him drugs, and prostituting him, trafficking him, while at the same time sitting on a committee. Now that is the hypocrisy that we see, which, if I'm not mistaken, if you read the Bible, Jesus said that's how you'll know them. They're hypocrites. They've got their own sins, and so he warned about those who were, all the time paying attention to everybody else's splinter in their eye, and he says, worry about the mote in your own eye. And he warns us that my favorite twist of that is he said, if you judge people the same measure, the level, your measurement of how you judge them, that will come back. And so I have found that to be so true in my life. The people that have judged me the harshest, the ones who've been the cruelest to me and pronounced the most heartbreaking rejections over me, have ended up having some of the worst moral failures. And an example of that is the committee that disciplined me out of First Methodist, 40 people. Out of that 40 people who disciplined me out of First Methodist, 37 of them have had horrific moral failures in their own life. And that's been 25 years ago. I mean, everything from, they had secret mistresses, they had hookers down in Brazil. I mean, it's all over the place. I mean, one man was a pediatrician and was sexually molesting his adopted daughters. And so they've had horrific moral failures. And so that's where we see it manifested at the state Senate. We see it manifested at the House of Representatives and the governor's office. When we see legislators who want to hate somebody because of their race, their sexual orientation, or their other religion, usually they have some internal unresolved issues of their own.
What is the most important thing that Christians and church members can do to support their LGBTQ plus neighbors, siblings, and community at large?
I think you need to ask yourself, what would Jesus do? How would Jesus have me treat these people? Just the most delicate, tender things. One of the things that we see every year, and we use it as salve or a healing balm, is for years we've been feeding about 400 people on Thanksgiving Day. And there are people in this room who know what that's like because they've been there and they've washed the dishes and brought the mashed potatoes and things like that. But you know how affirming it is that they come in and then we emphasize over and over again, this food that you're eating today was provided by the hands of faithful people who wanted to provide this for you because they know you're not welcome in your family's homes on Thanksgiving. Maybe you can't go home dressed and affirm the gender that you identify with. But we've created the space so it feels like Thanksgiving, and we want you to know it's the church people who provided this food. That's a wonderful thing. I would encourage them to invite LGBTQ people to their church and tell them you'll be loved, you'll be affirmed here. You call it evangelize them or convert them, whatever you want to do, but let them know that they'll be valued and they'll be respected in your church. And that, tell them where your church's position is, that, our church has a position that LGBTQ persons are welcome here, and we don't see them as broken and disordered or needing, to be repaired. You'll be loved and accepted here. So those are things that I think are opportunities for you to serve. We have a lot of LGBT people who end up being able to heal from their trauma when they see active expressions of individuals saying, the way we've treated you was wrong, forgive us. One of the most meaningful things we have happen at the Pride Parade is we step off at Boston Avenue and we get to the corner of 6th and Boston. For years, there has been a Lutheran group of individuals who have stood there with signs that have said, forgive us for what the church has done to you. Please forgive us for the way Christians have treated you. Every year after the parade, I have people tell me all the time, did you see this? Did you see that? And how much that meant to them. And so those little active expressions of saying, please forgive us for the way you've been treated. And be a friend to them. They don't have many Christian friends.
For the Resist Harm movement, each month has a particular theme. So January's theme was resist, February's theme was love, March's theme is lament. And I think, your point about the reception of Christians who are lamenting the harm that they've done and the impact that that can have for LGBTQ folks. I think there's a lot of power in that confession and in that lament.
For years, I was a Free Will Baptist, and the best thing I liked about being a Free Will Baptist, theologically, it's pretty identical to, I became a Free Will Baptist because I went to a campus ministry group, and they promised me they could pray away the gay, and that didn't work real well. But one of the things that is an active part of their worship is a couple of times a year they have feet washing services, of where they wash the feet they call it washing the feet of the saints. Very emotional service. Lots of healing happens. And I've often thought, man, it'd be beneficial. It would be very beneficial for a church to say, here we're going to wash your feet at Pride. We're just going to be here to tell you we're here to serve you, because that's what Jesus is saying. When he washed the feet, we're here to serve you. Not that you have dirty feet, but we're here to serve you. So,
do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Just that I would say it is such a blessing to me that my faith and who I am and the work that I do, and I know I'm odd, and I know I'm different, and I know I'm unique, that I'm not your standard church person, that there's some things that make you have to kind of think twice about. But it is such a blessing to be able to look forward to going to church and not be afraid of somebody's going to say something and I'm going to be offended. And it's not always been like that here for me. I went through a real painful experience when we had marriage equality, and the Bishop of Oklahoma blasted us, and I had a Methodist minister and a Presbyterian minister, and there I was sandwiched in between them and the Tulsa World on the front page, of where the Presbyterian minister and the Methodist minister and the Methodist bishop were blasting marriage equality. And I had worked so hard on that, and I knew personally what that meant to people. And it's wonderful that I can come to church every Sunday. People are glad I'm here, may not know necessarily what to think of me, but they're glad I'm here. And just like a couple of weeks ago, when our pastor was preaching about some things that you need to do to serve, and he was listing a whole list of things that you could do. And just out of the clear blue, he mentioned there was some stuff that you could do at the Equality Center. It's wonderful that it doesn't have to be veiled. It's always been here, as long as I've been here. It's been a veiled, subtle nod, where they would occasionally say, in a prayer or something like, no one should experience discrimination because of who they love. And it just be in a, little slip like that. But it is encouraging to me that the church is making its position very public, and that the people in the pew that I sit next to and sit around are making sure that because I know when we had some town hall meetings, I was shocked. Like, some of the people said some of the things. I was just shocked, had no idea that's how they felt about my presence in the church. I don't know if they're still here. I'm still here, and it's nice to be able to come someplace where I feel like I'm welcome.
Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. Please join us for more of our Resisting Harm series, Voices of LGBTQ+ Inclusion in the Oklahoma UMC podcasts in the coming weeks. We are located at 1301 South Boston Avenue in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma. Check out our social media for more information on what's going on at Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. We can be found on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. We'll talk to you next time. Thank you.